Last night, while we were sleeping, and this morning, while we were going about our business, Jesus was arrested and beaten and hauled before one judge and sent in chains to another, chained in the basement dungeon of another house, struck and mocked by the police and the soldiers, made to carry the instrument of his own execution in the streets where he fell and where people walked around him. He was stripped and killed and left to hang upon a cross. Earlier this month, at the happening weekend for high school youth, we heard a very dramatic reading of the Stations of the Cross. And at each station, the people who were reading talked about how this weight was more than any other human had borne, how this suffering was unique. And I couldn't help thinking that I don't believe that. In fact, I think this wasn't an extraordinary act of heroism. I think instead that this was an ordinary killing on a perfectly ordinary day, a busy holiday weekend. You know, the people around him probably didn't even notice what was going on. They probably didn't even notice him, except that he gave them an excuse to gear up and go get a troublemaker. They gave him an excuse to join in the crowd hanging around by the chief priest's house. They gave him an excuse to stand around gossiping, to stand around in the flickering red lights and wonder what was going on. An excuse to walk the police beat and the courthouse beat. An excuse to step around the man fallen in the street, muttering and shaking their heads. An excuse to watch a lynching. An excuse to go home and complain about the wailing. You know, you just can't get any peace anymore. An excuse to enjoy another meal while the family is in town for the holiday weekend. An excuse to sleep securely in their own beds. How easy it is for us to identify with people in this story. How easy it is for us to identify with those faithful people who are grateful that the police are taking care of them. How easy it is to identify with the police themselves, who are checking on our church at the middle of the night to make sure everything's okay. It's easy to identify with the weekend partiers who have to step around the bums in the street on a Thursday night. It's easy to identify with the crowds who can't even remember who we're cheering for. Barabbas, it's that son of the father guy, right? Yeah, okay, Barabbas. To identify with the onlookers who know, well, he must have done something wrong to deserve this. It's easy to identify with the people who just want to enjoy their holiday meal in peace. Is that too much to ask? But how hard it is. How hard it is actually to identify with everyone in this story. How hard it is to identify with everyone who is arrested in front of his friends and carted away in shame. How hard to identify with everyone in a holding cell late at night, tired and bruised and scared. To identify with everyone who slips and falls in the street while people walk around him and make jokes at his expense. To identify with everyone who cries out alone as sharp pain overtakes them and as they struggle to breathe. Why do we call this Friday good? Why do we call this Friday good? I don't think it's because Jesus in his suffering was an extraordinarily heroic man. But I think it's because the Son of Man, because God, out of love for us, became a perfectly ordinary person who endured what perfectly ordinary people endure. And it's for that reason that we can begin to identify not only with everyone like him, but also like him, we can begin to identify with God. Because of Jesus, the writer to the Hebrews says, we can hold fast to the confession of our hope because he who has promised is faithful. Because of the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain of the temple, that is, through his flesh. And since we now have a great priest over the house of God, we can approach with a true heart in full assurance of faith. At that heavenly altar, we will stand next to not an extraordinary hero, but a perfectly ordinary person who has endured what ordinary people endure. And at this altar, we stand next to perfectly ordinary people in the company of Jesus. And we offer what we endure to the God who knows us from the inside and who loves us. That's why we call this perfectly ordinary Friday good. Amen.